Hello, everyone. Welcome to this ongoing series of conversations. If you have joined one before, this is going to be very similar. If you haven't, welcome. The first thing, logistically, before I introduce both Samantha and Mark, please know throughout this, your questions are the most important. So there is a question dialog box for you to input questions to help guide this conversation. We'd much rather this be based on what you want to gain from this presentation than what we think you would want to gain from this. Towards the end of this, I will also give the ability, if we have some time for you, if you'd rather speak your questions, and you can raise your hands towards the end of the presentation if you'd rather talk it out loud. Also, just logistically, I will be doing my best as I'm guiding this conversation to input all the questions into the chat box so that you all can follow along if you'd like. And just one other thing logistically, I'm going to launch a poll right now just to get an understanding of the audience members. So if you could just complete that quickly. And while you guys are completing that, I will do the introduction. So Mark Battelle here is a co-founder of Westport College Prep. He brings a vast, extensive background in psychology, and he has helped develop and form the Gap Year program at Westport. And then Samantha Feynman is the director of New Frontiers Executive Function Coaching, tackling a lot of the learning struggles and challenges through an executive functioning lens. Okay, I'm going to close the poll now. So it looks like a majority are professionals. We have around 75% of professionals attending today, 25% parent of a high school student. This is going to be over 100% because you can answer more than once, but 6% of participants are parents of probably college students and others. So to get us started, and again, I'll just put through in the chat so that you guys can see where you can submit questions. To jump right in, just start us with a foundation of Mark of what is a gap year? Like people have, I think, different ideas of what that means. So it'd be great if you could give a broad approach to what a gap year is, and then also specific to Westport of what that looks like in the manifestation of Westport.
Sure. In the simplest terms, a gap year is a period of time taken out of the typical educational or occupational pathway. About 2% of American students take gap years. So it's 40,000 out of about 2 million college-bound students. It's much higher in Europe, and they've been doing it in Europe and in Australia for longer than we have. The idea is that the people who take a gap year are folks who, one, are looking for a break from school. When you ask students, that's one of the most common reasons they give. And then two, people who need more time to develop, to get to know what their actual interests are. And so those are really the two groups of folks who take gap years. And it can range in terms of academic content. I would include in gap years the PG year or postgraduate year that some students do at a boarding school, which is highly academic. And on the other end, you've got highly non-academic volunteer opportunities, tourism opportunities, or a kind of a mix or hybrid like what we've created at Westport College Prep, which involves academic course instruction that is leveled somewhere between high school and college so that students can get exposure to higher level material in a way that's scaffolded and appropriate for neurodiverse learners and people who need more time before they're ready for full college content. In addition, they can take a course or more courses for credit at Landmark College through a partnership that we have, so they can earn some college credit. And for many students, particularly special education students, having some academic focus in the gap year makes a lot of sense.
Cool. And so, Sam, with that, as a professional, if a family came to you, what are some of the reasons why you might recommend a gap year? Why you might recommend saying, hey, why don't you check out Westport's gap year program? Like, where does that recommendation come from? And I know everyone's not like one size fits all, but what are some of those indicators that at least a gap year might be worth looking into?
I think that, we want to consider a gap year when college potentially maybe in the future, but maybe not, maybe the student is not ready for college right now. And so they may need to develop some skills necessary to be successful when they get to college. And it could be a combination of, developing independence, executive function, social skills, academic foundations. But if they're just, if college seems to be in the future, but it's just not, they're not ready for it right now, then a gap year could be the time that they need to develop the skills that will get them to be more college ready.
And so with that, just to drive that a little further, Sam, on the one end, would you say for the actual students to figure out if they're ready? And then on the other end, for the parents to see, is this an investment worth making? And is that important to separate that out? Is it important to focus more on if the student needs it or with the parents' investment options? Like, how does that figure in for some as a recommendation you might give?
Well, I think it's all about what, again, the student's readiness, and what they think that they're ready for may be different than what they're ready for. And what the parents think they're ready for may be very different than what they're ready for. So really just looking at where are the students currently? What are they, what is their skill set? And is their skill set what is needed to be an independent, successful college student? It goes much farther than the academics. It goes into, really being able to be in the driver's seat of your own life, and being able to monitor yourself and make decisions based on understanding what needs to be accomplished and how to actually get that thing accomplished. So, again, it goes into that, whole world of executive functioning that is really incredibly important for a student to be in the driver's seat of their own learning, of their own lives. And that's a real necessity when you get to college, because, before college, there's a lot of hands in the pot, including the parents, when it comes to a student's day-to-day responsibilities. For the vast majority of high school students, their parents are still doing a heavy amount of scheduling of appointments for them, monitoring their homework, being a point of contact for teachers at school, and that doesn't translate into the college environment. So the parents have to be willing to give that up, and the students need to be able to take that on in order to be successful in that new environment. So we really have to assess whether or not the students are ready to do that independently. Just because they're not doing it independently and their parents are doing it for them doesn't necessarily mean they can't do it independently. It just might be that people are doing things for them. Those people need to back up a little bit, and so the students have the ability to demonstrate whether or not they can be independent before making that transition.
And so just before moving to the next topic. Yep.
Casey, could I just jump in there?
Yep.
Because I want to underscore how important the readiness piece is, and to Sam's point that it really does need to be assessed from multiple perspectives. The student has to have the motivation and the inclination, right, to take the next step. The parents have to be ready financially and otherwise, And it's often, this decision is often facilitated by the team of experts that the family has assembled. In the olden days, college readiness was simply reflected by the courses that the student took, the GPA, and the standardized test score. Well, that's not enough if you really want to get the fullest, richest possible experience out of attending a college. You really need to be ready. And the research suggests there are several domains of readiness that should be considered. One is certainly courses, course content, mastery of the academic materials. The next one is something like those skills you need that cut across the curriculum, like writing and analytic thinking. The third category is these non-cognitive skills, which Samantha mentioned, executive functioning for sure, right? All this important stuff about time management and study skills and work habits, critically important. And then the fourth area is really college knowledge, understanding the process of applying to a college, understanding what to expect from a college. And this means, right, what's the political scene at the college? What's the culture? What is the Office of Disability Services like? How's the counseling center? I was a first generation college student, and I didn't know what a college was in high school necessarily. And that was a very steep learning curve. So to be truly ready is, I think, vitally important. And I'll just make one more point from my own experience. I got to college and I would go to the lectures and it would be like, well, just a wall of words. And it was a much, much more enriched experience than a high school class. And so it takes time, and time can be wasted. I spent a lot of my own training in college counseling centers. And of course, I've taught lots of undergraduate college courses. So you see really very, very easily and quickly when someone is not ready for the college experience. And that's just very unfair to students. So that's one set of reasons why we launched a more academically focused gap year.
And so this is one question from an audience, and it's amazing. It's what I was going to do as a follow-up to you, Mark. So, so one of the ideas is, if we're doing a gap year, how can we support the individuals to be ready? Like, what are we trying to accomplish, and what does that look like to be effective and efficient during that year? And I want to drive that even a little bit further and ask you, Mark. So as Sam said, the parents might have been heavily involved in high school and they're not in college. So to drive a little further, what are your thoughts on parent involvement during a gap year? How do you guys approach that of the parents that want to be heavily involved versus the idea of maybe a point of this gap year is to get them uninvolved? So just some thoughts on that, on being efficient with that gap year and the role of trying to get them ready for college.
Oh, it's a great question. And you could think about gap years on a continuum from highly structured to highly unstructured. If you're backpacking through Europe, that's going to be a highly unstructured experience. The gap year should be really intentional and should be carefully conceived to meet the needs of the student and the family. The transition from parenting your own child to a university operating in loco parentis in the place of the parents is daunting for most families. And particularly if families have a student with special needs, it becomes very difficult to navigate how much to be involved. What we do in our gap year program is we attempt to fade the parental support over time. And of course, students can come to us for a year or 2 years or whatever is needed to get them ready to go. And sometimes parents need a lot of support finding out how they can safely fade their effort, because it is hard to let go.
And I think that just touches on such a good point of it looks different for everyone. It really bases on the purpose of the gap year. What are you trying to achieve? So I think that's always important to start, and hearing about the flexibility of your program, it's great. So Sam, just before we jump back to you, I want one more thing towards Mark. We're living in a pandemic. Things are remote. So have you noticed an impact on the effectiveness of gap year programs in general? And how are these programs adapting to this quasi new normal of we don't know how long things will be virtual on college campuses. So how is that reflected in the structure and design of gap year programs?
Well, any good gap, well, first let me say there's very little research on gap years. And of course, being a scientist, I'm always looking at the empirical research base, and it's only slowly developing. Many of the articles that you see about effectiveness come from Europe. So we don't have a lot of hard data yet. What I can tell you is that about 90% of students who do a gap year then enroll in a four-year institution. And they rate themselves as more mature and more interpersonally effective. And so I think we have some evidence that the gap year can drive maturity, it can drive decisiveness in terms of academic plan. Many students who take a gap year start out quite undecided and unclear about what their future college intention might be. And they get that year of neural development, and they get that year of living with meaning and purpose, ideally in an intentionally designed gap year, so that they can go to college stronger. The way COVID has affected our program is we've gone 100% virtual, and that can work well for some students or not well for other students. And one question would be, okay, if we're virtual, do you attend your first year of college virtually, or do you do a virtual gap year? And that depends on where the student is and what they need.
And so Sam, I'd love to hear from an executive functioning standpoint, it's about adapting to your goal changes and how do you adapt towards that. My academic side wants to use the term metacognition for professionals in this room, but how have you seen that a gap year helps with what Mark was talking about there of knowing themselves more, increasing their confidence, and how have you seen that through your work of the importance of that? The importance of knowing yourself more and understanding what you're working towards. And then if you could just step back a little bit of why the adapting of this type of stuff to a virtual environment is important for the world we're living in now.
Yeah, so I think what you just said goes back to that whole concept of really understanding that once the students do go to college, they're in the driver's seat of everything that happens. So if they need help, they need to ask for it. If they need to study, they need to set up time to do so. If they need to go to class, they need to get themselves there. So it's a very student self-driven system, and that requires a lot of self-reflection. It requires a lot of metacognition, and so you need to be able to think about how you learn, think about your experiences, and make decisions moving forward based on what works for you and what doesn't work for you. And so looking at it from that lens and looking at it from the lens, I love how Mark broke up the different areas to be college ready, right? So look at it from the perspective of those 4 dimensions that he outlined in terms of courses and content. Like, are you able to follow different syllabi and different requirements for different courses that aren't connected to each other. That's a college format, right? And so a lot of times in high school, teachers work on teams and there's collaboration amongst the faculty. Colleges, they work by departments. So your science professor and your English professor may not have ever even met each other. So they may both set up finals or midterms or finals for you on the same day because they're not collaborating on how to make your life easier as a student. So that requires you to be in the driver's seat to say, wow, I see down the road that I have multiple exams, multiple assignments, multiple things happening at once. I need to schedule myself out so that I can make sure I get everything done by the deadline and not procrastinate it so that I'm waiting till the last minute. And that requires a lot of understanding who you are as a learner. With a gap year program, it allows you, if you don't self-reflect and you're not metacognitive at the level at which you need to be in college, a gap year allows you to develop those skills. Without those skills, it's very hard for you to set yourself up for success when you get to college. Nobody is monitoring those things. So many of the clients that we've worked with, they have to develop those skills before they get to college. Because if they don't have a way of checking themselves to make sure they're on track towards success. So, it's really important. And I think a gap year gives you that ability to do so. This, when it comes to online learning and virtual and COVID, it's not an ideal situation, but it's the situation that we've been handed, right? And the skills that we're talking about are even that much more important to have when you're talking about going to college where you may be, working in a virtual format. An online class, a virtual class is much less dynamic and much more just about getting, how you engage with the curriculum yourself, how you monitor yourself, and how you get the assignments done. So it's even less of that kind of back and forth of checking for understanding with other people. So it's even that much more important to make sure that you're taking online classes or going to college virtually, that you have the skills to be able to self-monitor and ask for help when something is confusing for you. Because that feedback, that corrective feedback, is taken away from a virtual format of a classroom. Now you're talking about not having a teacher there to raise your hand and say, "What? Can you say that again? I didn't get that," or "Can you clarify your comments?" So, it moves us more towards linear, but it highlights more, that much more of the important level of being able to monitor your own learning style, how you're doing, and how to move forward.
I also just want to throw in, oftentimes a gap year is the first time where it's lower stakes to actually take the time to think about this stuff. Throughout high school, grades, college, I got to do well. So you never have time to step back. And so that's why I wanted to touch on that metacognitive piece. A gap year is maybe you're taking classes at a community college, like through Westport, doing it with Landmark. Transfer credits don't carry the GPA over. So there's lower stakes where you can take chances to try something new and develop that metacognition.
And potentially even take a reduced course load so that you get used to college classes rather than taking 5 of them all at once. So there's a little bit more flexibility in being able to get yourself ready for what a traditional college environment looks like.
And so, Mark, I have 2 kind of logistical questions, a little less theory. But for some of the parents here that are thinking, if they're joining this webinar, they're clearly interested. So one, do you know if 529 funds can be used for gap year tuition?
I will have to get back to you on that. I think the answer is probably no, because when we initially thought about how would we get the program accredited or approved, neither the higher ed folks nor the K-12 folks deal in this realm. And in fact, there's only one group, as far as I know, that really puts in a lot of effort to accredit gap year programs, and that's the Gap Year Association. It takes 3 years of being a candidate to receive accreditation. So we won't be doing that for a while, but there are a number of accredited gap programs. I think if they're not associated with a university, it would be hard to use the funds, but I'm not completely certain.
So we'll follow up, the audience member who submitted that, we'll follow up individually for that. And so just one other general aspect, are the deadlines for applying for gap years somewhat lined up with colleges? So as families are thinking about this, and you can talk particularly for Westport, a lot of people like to keep options open. So as they're moving into their senior year, are deadlines more lined up with similar deadlines for colleges, or is it rolling admission? What does that look like? And you can talk particularly for Westport if you have that answer.
Sure. And as a caveat, I'm certainly not a gap year placement professional. There are such people, and you might even find them through the Gap Year Association. But I can speak to my own program. We have rolling admission for sure. I would suspect that many other programs do as well. But again, this is fairly new. Gap year participation is only beginning to increase, and programs are beginning to develop. So we're sort of at the front end of this.
Awesome. Thanks. Wanted to get those logistical ones out of the way. So back to, so is it the eventual goal of both college and gap years towards employment? And how important is it to use employment as motivation for individuals going through a gap year program? Or is it more important to start with, we don't know what our goal is. We don't know what we're working towards. So just, Mark, if you could speak about the role that employment plays, and how we can start getting individuals to see that that's the end goal. Is that something that should start right after high school using a gap year, or is that something that might develop later? And I know it's not going to be the same for everyone, but if you could touch on that in broad strokes.
Sure. My feeling is that what the two have in common is the idea that they bring meaning and purpose to one's life. And yes, employment is a goal. If you earn a college degree over the course of your lifetime, you will also earn more than $1 million, or you'll earn more than $1 million compared to someone who does not have a bachelor's degree. So there is a financial incentive to go to college. In many respects, college is now the gatekeeper to the professional job market. But as someone who values liberal arts, I think the idea is really to get to know yourself and to develop your strengths, repair weaknesses so that you can be a good citizen and a good human being, whether or not you pursue a vocation.
Okay. And then Sam, how do you see that playing in? Like, are 18-year-olds ready to think about working for the rest of their lives, and that's why I'm going to college, or that's why I'm doing a gap year? Is that important to involve within motivating to go through these programs or college at that point, in your experience with that? Or is that something that comes a little bit later in development?
I think it's dependent on student to student. Some students, they know what they want to do and they go into the experience knowing it, and they study it and they love it and they're passionate about it and they come out and they do it. I think others, myself included, changed my major 2 or 3 times in college, and it was based on the experiences that I was having. I think what is important for students to understand is that it's okay not to know what you want to do in terms of employment, and you can use the time during a gap year and use the time during college to help to start to figure out what you like and what you're good at and what motivates and drives you. You know, I think that students do need to have an understanding that, you know, what you choose, what you're good at, and doing it for a living can be two totally different things. And when you do start to narrow in on a profession, you want to make sure that you really do enjoy it and you do like doing that work, because we spend a lot of time at work. We spend a lot of time working. And so, you know, you just want to make sure that what you think you want to do is really what you want to do. And that's through experiences in the gap year, it's through experiences in college, but it's through that metacognitive piece. It's about thinking about it, right? And again, like some of the students that we work with, Mark, that you work with, and the clients that we work with, we see that sometimes there's that disconnect, that metacognitive disconnect. Oh, I want to be a YouTuber. Well, what does that mean, right? Like that, what does that look like? How do you prepare for that? Is that realistic? So, you know, they have to think about it through the lens of developing that ability to think about the decisions that they're making, who they are, how it's going to affect them in the future. Again, another executive functioning piece, right? How are my actions now going to affect me short term and long term? And how is that going to play out? Having those outside conversations is the important piece. Almost, it's more important than choosing what you want to do in the beginning, right? That first foundation is that conversation of how do I figure it out, and what do I do with that information, and how do I know it's valid?
I think I don't want to go too much into the employment realm. That can be a whole separate conversation that we can talk about for hours. I think in regards to gap year, we're buying time to figure out employment that will be motivating. Employment is something that we all have to do, unless we're so blessed that we have so much money we never have to worry about it. But the goal of a gap year in college is to find employment that is meaningful, employment that is motivating. I went to school as an engineer, and I dropped out the first day of classes of engineering classes. I was like, it's not for me. So gap year is helping, as Mark talked about. Let's find more time to discover who we are. What courses might I be interested in? So
well,
I did want to. Yep, go ahead.
Casey, adolescence is the time to define one's identity, right? Adolescents and young adults are asking, who am I, and who am I in relation to others? And you can't necessarily know what you like or dislike if you haven't been exposed to it. Your engineering story is a case in point. It works in reverse too. A student at college can take a course with a fantastic professor who changes the course of the student's life. And this happens more frequently than you think. That's why the first 2 years in a liberal arts institution are supposed to be more open, so that you can sample everything, try everything. The gap year gives you more developmental time to be prepared to sample everything.
So that's perfect of a segue here. So in light of COVID-19, what are some, and I don't want to put you too much in a selling position, Mark, but why is now the best time to take a gap year? Colleges a lot of them are virtual, and they're not cutting their prices in order to have an all virtual campus. Why is now might be the best time to be considering a gap year, going into a major period of unknown? And just in that larger picture of things aren't in the ideal, like could this buy some time for waiting until we can get to some normalcy? And just like one other thing I'll throw in there is, for those with learning differences, remote learning is difficult. for a lot of people. So how could a gap year really be, whereas maybe it wasn't a consideration for some families prior, how is it important now in light of the current situation?
So, the idea is to take full advantage of college. And college is more than just the courses. So if you're wondering if you can take full advantage of what's on offer virtually, then, and you think you may not be able to, then it would make sense to do something else for at least a year until the course of the pandemic plays out. So from that perspective, it makes sense. And at one point, I heard on one of the news sources that 1 in 5 students, high school students, were contemplating a gap year because they weren't sure that they could maximize the value of the college. And if you've got 4 glorious years, spending one of them getting only X% of the experience may not make a lot of sense. And then with respect to your second point, we individualize the curriculum for our students because we're really seeking neurodiversity, and we're catering to folks who've got a learning disability or who've got a social cognitive weakness. That could be folks who are on the autism spectrum, for example. And so we explicitly teach metacognition and provide social skills practice embedded within the educational process. So that's how we're dealing with the virtualness.
Cool. And so Samantha, as far as how do we balance between our world is digitizing, our world is going onto the internet, this is a new reality. There are going to be some things that are here to stay. There are certain aspects that are here to stay. So how, for parents that might be considering a gap year because, well, we'll see what college is, how do you push them towards, look, this could be a good goal of, yes, virtual learning was difficult, but there's aspects of it that build up skills that your child will need versus that importance. So just some thoughts on that idea of gap years have their time and place and their importance, but we still need to tackle some of these skill deficits. So the deficits of why was remote learning hard? And what are those points that we might need to focus on developing?
Yeah, I mean, I again, like it's all about looking, at each individual in terms of what are their academic foundations, what are their social skills, what are their executive function skills, how independent are they? And remember that, a virtual model of learning is going to have a lot of less corrective feedback, a lot less social behavioral modeling, a lot less opportunity for social connections, a lot less structure, and just a delay in time from an expectation to when it's due. So those all require high levels of executive functioning skills. And so, if you're going into the experience with limited skills in those areas and the expectation is that they're higher because it's a virtual format, then, considering a gap year to develop those skills could be very advantageous. I've always been a big believer that college doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be an all or nothing traditional trajectory, right? It doesn't have to be, well, my son or daughter is going away to a 4-year school, they're going to live on campus and, and take a full course load. Like, it's some of the most successful students they don't necessarily do it in a traditional format because that's what works for them. And if the alternative is setting them up to do a traditional experience, but they're not going to be successful, put yourself in the shoes of the student. How are they going to feel when they're set up for failure and they end up coming, not being able to take the virtual classes, or if they do go away and take virtual classes, having to come home. I know a lot of colleges are talking about that, where they're bringing students back on campus and providing classes virtually. And that's a concern, that's a big concern, because you're taking the students and putting them in an unstructured environment, and the expectation with an unstructured academic expectation. And so with students that are kind of teetering on the line of being able to handle and structure their own unstructured environment, it could be setting them up, to be very challenging. So I would just, I would take myself out of the box and look at what are the expectations going to be, and what is my child, or what is the student ready for right now? Can they do these things independently? And if they can't do them independently, do they recognize when things are breaking down? And from there, do they ask somebody for help so that they can turn things around for themselves? Because the last thing you want to do is set a student up to go away to college where there's no structure of a college classroom, and they're kind of suffering and flailing on their own in their dorm room. It's just, it could be very disruptive to a certain kind of type of student. So, those are the things you want to take into consideration. What are they actually offering? What is it going to look like? And if it's, and if these are challenges that my son or daughter has had in historically, or the student has had historically, those challenges aren't going to go away. And so maybe a gap year is a right time to take a step back with, and work on these skills virtually, so that when things do open up again, or, when they start to take virtual classes or hybrid classes, that they're prepared for that new model, rather than the old.
So there's one more audience question, and then I have one last question. If anyone else wants to submit, please do now. So one audience member just wanted, Mark, if you could just repeat, I believe it was 4 domains you believed for college readiness. One of the audience members just wanted to catch that again, if you don't mind.
Sure. Yeah, sure. So it's content knowledge, like you have mastery of English, right? And then it's those skills that cut across the different classes. Writing, for example, you have to write in every class. Analytic thinking, you have to engage in this kind of thinking across the curriculum. The third one is what we call non-cognitive factors. So everything that Samantha teaches, right? All the executive functions. I would add to that interpersonal skills. And then finally, the idea of college knowledge, having a basic understanding of what college is, what its function is, what are the different types of colleges, how to navigate the admissions and financial aid process, and how to comport oneself once one actually manages to land on a campus.
I was gonna say, I love that concept of college knowledge, because that is an area where we see a lot of students that have a difficult time with flexible thinking, really have a tough time in that, understanding that it's a new environment, that you're going to be communicating with people differently, that there's more flexibility in classes, but also that's that shift into being in the driver's seat, right? And that nobody's going to reach out to you and ask you how you're doing. You have to monitor how you're doing, and you have to ask for help if you're falling behind in something. That's all that kind of unwritten curriculum that is so important to be college ready. I love that. I love that concept of college knowledge. It's so, it's a really important domain.
It's so funny because at New Frontiers, we have a similar approach of like content-based knowledge. So as Mark was talking about, that real academic knowledge, the social communication, as he says, the interpersonal relations, the interpersonal skills, self-advocacy, executive functions, all leading towards different forms of independence. So you'll hear from a lot of different people, but the most important thing that I just always like to highlight about college, and Mark has said this a lot throughout today, the academic piece is only one small portion of what being college ready means. And it's for too long has been the major focus. So it's really important to zoom out. Can your kid wake themselves up? Can they do their own laundry? Do they brush their teeth? Because all of that indirectly impacts the academic ability as well. And so one a little specific to Westport. So just if you could briefly touch on Mark, and then this can also be an individual follow-up afterwards, but how do you guys integrate executive functioning support into Westport's program? How is the focus on executive functioning support integrated into what you guys do during the gap year?
Oh, sure. So we were able to launch this program when our favorite special education teacher became available. And this is Lauren Macbeth, who taught for a decade at a really fantastic special ed school here in Connecticut. And so she manages the instruction across the students. And it's going to be all the things you would imagine, pre-teaching and reteaching and scaffolding and direct instruction is needed, and just highly individualized depending on what the student is presenting. And if we grow up to have 8 to 10 students in a cohort, that would be fantastic. And so it would be very small class size.
I think that's, I mean, really just to touch on that point more, executive functions is not something that you say, oh, we're going to sit down and learn about initiation today. And this sounds very similar. You can't pinpoint any one area. It's imbued in everything in the approach that you do it. So I totally respect that, Mark. If you can't pinpoint any one area, it's how you talk to them. It's how you design assignments. It's how you put the ball in their court. As Sam mentioned, it's putting them in the driver's seat. That's how you work on executive function. So it's not like this is the course we take. And so just one other follow-up with that, Mark, is do you find career and vocational assessments helpful in guiding what those gap years look like, in that individualized gap year that we've kind of been talking about? Do you find a career and vocational assessment helpful in determining what it looks like?
Well, generally, and over the course of my career as a clinical psychologist, I have not found career interest inventories to be particularly useful, because if you don't have the insight going into the questionnaire, then you're not going to get a very good coherent result coming out. And so we don't do those kind of assessments, and I'm not sure they're terribly helpful until the vocational identity is fairly well established. And one of the documented benefits of a gap year is that it can increase academic motivation significantly. And if you're more academically motivated, then you're in a position to, again, make the most of the college experience and be ready to have your mind blown by an amazing professor who will take you down a life path you didn't imagine for yourself.
I never thought I'd go to Africa, and I had a great professor that just like, I did research in Africa because of that professor.
Amazing.
I also love just about that is sometimes you think career vocational assessments, the goal is to know what my career and vocation is going to be. It gives me a #1 match. That's what I'm going to do the rest of the life. In my experience, I've only used it in a metacognitive approach. Can you imagine yourself doing that? And they're like, no, I don't want to do the #1 thing. So it's kind of, what are you using it for is important. So I want to throw out 2 quotes. I'm paraphrasing, but I hear this all the time. One of them I say all the time, and then one of them I hear often from families. And I just want to end on this note from hearing comments from Samantha and from Mark on this. So one of the things that I often hear from actual students is, I finally got it in my junior year. I got who I am. It just made sense my junior year. I finally got it. And then the other one I'll hear from parents and sometimes myself is, they just seem 5 years younger than they actually are. They seem developmentally 5 years behind their peers, whether it be maturity, emotional intelligence, executive functioning skills, but they just seem behind their peers. So with those 2 kind of quotes, I just wanted to hear, Sam, if you can start off with, where does a gap year fit in to those 2 statements that we so often hear in this profession and parents living through this? And then we can jump over to Mark, and these can be closing comments. Just before you guys go in, for anyone that, if you have additional questions from this line of thinking, submit them and we'll follow up individually afterwards with you guys. We just don't have time to get to it today. So Sam, if you could take it away there.
You're really challenging my working memory today, Casey. We're going to talk about that later.
So I don't know if I finally got it later in my college career. I wish I didn't have 2 years of crappy GPA. And then my kid is just not as developed as his peers.
Yeah, I think it's, I think that when you look at the K through 12 school model, generally speaking, a lot of students develop social emotional skills, executive function skills within the natural environment. And there are just some children that don't pick them up within the natural environment, and they need to be taught those skills. But these are not skills that are necessarily taught or there's time to teach during an academically rigorous high school experience. And so what we find is that we see that the students can, intellectually engage with high levels of curriculum, but they forget to hand in their homework, or they don't realize when something is due, or they procrastinate to the last minute. All of those underlying skills that are necessary to be able to access curriculum and demonstrate knowledge, make friends, make plans with friends, keep appointments, all of that stuff, if they're behind on those things aren't explicitly taught in a traditional high school, middle school, or high school learning environment. I think it's getting better. I think the schools are starting to understand it a little bit more and try to incorporate it more, but they still have very high levels of academic demands that they need to make. That there's just, these are the things that fall to the wayside in terms of direct instruction. And that's where a gap year can come in. A gap year can be there to continue to have the academic experience, because we certainly don't want, and Mark, that's what I love about your program, is that you're not putting academics to the wayside and saying, okay, let's just work on independent skills, because then what happens to the academics, right? We don't want to see a regression in the things that the students are good at, but we also want to provide them time to catch up with the things that will help them be even better with the things that they're good at. And that's what a gap year can do. And so for the students that are having a tough time getting themselves up out of bed and into class on time, missing their homework, having a tough time making friends, they don't know how to do their own laundry, they can't make themselves a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. The kids that, we have to look and say, is it because I'm doing it for them? And they could do it on their own, but I'm just, I as the parent need to take a step back, which I'm doing with my own children. My daughter's going into 7th grade. And so I'm, spending a lot of time this summer having her start to learn how to use the kitchen and cook and make things for herself. She's young and she needs supervision, but why not, right? Like now's a good time to get her starting to initiating those things and making her own bed and doing her own laundry. And that way I have plenty of time for those things to kind of happen before the expectation is that she does that independently. But that's me taking a step back. Now, once you take a step back, if the students still can't do them, your children can't do them, maybe they need some time to develop those skills, and they need to develop them with somebody that is not their parents, that is an outside mentor or coach or teacher that doesn't have an emotional connection with them, that can say, look, these are the things that are important for you when you go to Syracuse, when you go to Albany, when you go to, NYU, wherever you decide to go. You're going to have to be able to do these things by yourself. And if you can't, then it's going to be tough for you to manage those things and the academics and the social responsibilities and feeding yourself. So, I think that it happens. We just have to evaluate, is it happening because we're enabling our students to be that way? Or is it really that they have a deficit in these areas and we need some time to remediate these discrepancies?
So Mark, that I finally got in my junior year, I'm sure that's something that when you hear it, you're like, oh, if only you took a gap year sooner. And then that other idea of just some developmental, I don't want to say developmental delays, but like they're not developing at the same speed in different venues of development. So those kind of 4 areas of college readiness, maybe they're just behind. And just some thoughts on those 2 kind of statements that we often hear from both families or professionals working with individuals.
Well, I think simply put, life is not a straight line race, right? We have time. Students today will live for a very, very long time. They will probably have multiple marital partners, multiple careers, and they may live to be 100 years old. And so there's no rush. Brains develop on different timetables. And if you spend 2 years struggling more than you need to, well, that certainly can take a toll on your academic self-esteem as well, which we want to avoid. There was a group of researchers at George Mason University who asked students with disabilities. These were college students who felt ready to attend college from day one. What helped you feel ready? And the overwhelming response was, someone helped me get organized, and someone taught me how to take notes before I got here. This really helped with my readiness. In addition, they said the development of solid writing skills, having already experienced a college level amount of work, and having taken academically rigorous courses. If it takes an extra year to do this, I don't see why someone wouldn't consider it.
I think that's just, I like when we see constant themes through different venues that we talk about. Let's get rid of the idea of a 4-year college. There doesn't need to be freshman, sophomore, junior, senior. We all have different paths and different journeys. You don't have to be graduated by the time you're 22. Like all of this is this idea that we all need to fit into the same box and have the same pathway, and this is the only way to do it. And hopefully this is one of those societal remnants that can be tossed away, that gap years have a role for some people. Not everyone, but it's really important. It's important to know that this might be the best option for your kid. And don't try to force it into this idea of avoiding it because they have to graduate by 22. So on that note, I know we just got a last question. We'll follow up with that separately. I thank both Samantha and Mark. You guys really, like this just helps get away some stigmas and really seeing that this might be a good investment in helping better set people for success. From a coaching standpoint, we always say, don't force someone into coaching until they're ready for it. So maybe don't force someone into college until they're ready for it. It should really be a consideration, because if you have a bad experience, Mark talked about self-esteem, then it might be difficult to get back on the horse. So one last thing I just want to ask everyone here, There is a survey when you close out of this. Please complete it. It helps us. It also gives you an opportunity to ask any follow-up questions. We'll follow up with all of you guys individually. We appreciate it. If it doesn't pop up when you close out, you will get an email exactly 24 hours from right now. So all of that is really appreciated feedback. Again, thank you, Samantha. Thank you, Mark. These opportunities to get a little insight into your brains is so helpful for me, for all professionals here, and especially for families trying to make sense of what to do next. So really appreciate the feedback, and I hope you guys all have a great rest of the week and weekend.
Thanks,
Thank
Casey,
you.
for organizing everything.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Mark.
Bye-bye.